Hi and welcome. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. If you need to switch your camera off for whatever reasons, obviously feel free to do so. This program has today a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern. I will begin by asking our guest of honor questions for 10 or 12 minutes or so, but then it's open floor to the gallery. Welcome, David Miliband. It's great to see you, and we're delighted to have you with us today. So, David, thanks for being with us today, first and foremost.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Looking forward to the conversation.
David is a former MP. He is ex or former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. He's held various roles in government. He has performed beautifully, if I may say, as a writer and public intellectual on a variety of matters. And currently, and David, if I have it right, if I'm wrong, you'll correct me, for the last 7 years and change, he has been president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee based in New York. That is an organization that was founded in the 1930s by Einstein and others, today operating in 40-some countries around the world, with a staff of 30,000 some employees. It's important work, it's demanding work, it's dangerous work. David, I'm going to ask you in some moments about the work you've done in a speech last year, in an article this year for Foreign Affairs on the age of impunity, what it is and what to do about it. But before we do that, I think it would be a service if you told us, and I ask you to tell us a little bit about the current work of the International Rescue Committee, how you fared this last year in COVID and lockdown, and what the principal challenges are. David, over to you for that to start. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Good to be with you. So the International Rescue Committee was founded not as a general anti-poverty agency. It was founded with a very specific purpose to help people who weren't safe in their own countries and who needed to be offered haven from persecution. That was Einstein's vision. Today, we honor that vision as the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States, 25 offices across the country. Sadly, over the last 4 years, the number of refugees being allowed in has gone down from about 95,000 to about 15,000, but the current administration is committed to raise that number. But most of our work these days, I would say about $850 million of the $950 million budget, is working to help people around the world whose lives are shattered by conflict, persecution, and disaster. Those people are either in war zones, so I'm thinking Yemen, Syria, parts of Somalia, northeast Nigeria, parts of Afghanistan, in conflict zones. They're internally displaced inside their own country. You'll know that very large internal displacement in Ethiopia at the moment, or they are refugees in neighboring states. Turkey has 3.5 million refugees, Lebanon 1.5 million, Jordan, Ethiopia has refugees as well as internally displaced from its own conflict. Bangladesh, Pakistan has Afghan refugees. And so we're an agency that says that we're not here to boil the ocean, we're here to help people whose poverty and vulnerability comes from particular circumstance of being forcibly caught up in war, either as civilians caught in the war and in the crossfire, or forced to flee as a result of that. And we work across the arc of crisis, from the war zone to the internal displacement, the refugee resettlement. And I've just come off a call with our team in Germany. We also help integrate refugees into their new lives for the minority who come to the US or Germany or a small number of other countries. You'll probably be vaguely aware that there are more refugees than for a very long time and more internally displaced than for a very long time. 82 million people, the figures came out last week, who are, in other words, more than 1% of the global population, forcibly displaced, not economic migrants, but those forcibly displaced, about 45 million of them still within their own country, internally displaced, about 35 million refugees and asylum seekers. We're an agency that tries to defy some of the stereotypes that either you're an emergency organization or you're about long-term poverty. We're about trying to help people survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. So primary healthcare is a very important part of our work, water and sanitation, but we also work significantly to help people stand on their own feet, education, employment, and livelihoods. And 2/3 of our clients are women. and there are multiple inequalities that women and girls face around the world, and we try to make extra effort in that regard. And then final bit of just painting of the picture before we get on to some of the substantive questions. We're about 3/4 government funded, a quarter privately funded. That ratio has changed over the last 5 or 6 years. We've raised our private support, and we are in an expansion mode, because you asked about the last year. Here's the interesting thing. If we'd been meeting a year ago, I would have said to you, look, COVID is going to be an absolute killer for the people that we serve. They lack basic health infrastructure. They've got a whole range of underlying conditions, and I think it's going to run rampant because public health is going to be so difficult. Actually, what's happened is that although the data is very patchy, there's very little testing, so the fog of war really applies in the places that we work. But I can tell you from our health centers, we're not overrun with people dying from COVID. There's a lot of asymptomatic transmission, obviously, but somehow the fact that a lot of our clients are outdoors most of the time, the fact that they are young, half the populations we serve are under the age of 20, have provided some degree of protection. But here's what's really hit us much harder than we expected. The economic consequences of the crisis for the people we serve have been much, much greater. 40% increase in people dependent on humanitarian aid around the world. So 235 million people depend upon humanitarian aid around the world. About 90% of them are in 20 countries, all of which we work in. So the last year has been enormously testing for our teams, keeping them safe. But it's also drawn us into the nexus between persecution and poverty. And we are trying to react to that. So I hope that's not too long, but I hope that paints a picture of what we're doing.
No, not at all. And I think it was necessary, and it creates a very good foundation for now, David, the conversation going forward. You spoke last year at the World Economic Forum and wrote this year in Foreign Affairs on the age of impunity and what to do about it. And if I could ask our managing editor, Michelle High, at her convenience, to put the speech and the article into chat for folks. If you haven't read it or read these things, please do so. David, a number of things came to mind when I reread the piece and the speech today. One is your observation about the retreat from rule of law. Two is, as you put it, and the bread and butter of what you all do, checks bouncing on civilian protection. And then three, I was intrigued by the challenge of this. You say that 69 of the top 100 richest entities in the world today are businesses, private businesses, and they have to stand up, step up, and become more responsible. That's a long way of saying, could you describe the problem a little bit? And I'd love to hear you drill a little bit deeper on the private sector, what it is and ought to be doing.
Thanks, I'll do my best. So here's my argument. There are more civilians being killed in war zones than at any time really since records began. 70% of the victims of war are now civilians. There are more aid workers that are being killed for 20 years. There are more people fleeing violence than since records began. The amount of ethnic cleansing that's going on has risen, and the abuse of international law has risen in conflict zones. And I make a number of points about this. One, there never was a golden age. None of us would subscribe to the belief that because things were written in the UN Charter that civilians should have sacrosanct rights in war zones, that there was ever a golden age. But what we can see from the data is that since about 2005, 2006, there's been a steady decrease in adherence to international law and international humanitarian law in conflict, and that's by states and by non-state actors. Point one. Point two, I call this impunity because impunity, as I'm sure you know, impunity means actions without consequence, crimes without punishment, decisions without accountability. And I think that impunity is what has happened when two workers for the IRC are driving an ambulance in northwest Syria and they get bombed by Russian planes and get killed. That's impunity, because no one's held accountable for what is evidently a crime. It's the same when the Saudi-led coalition bombed a coachload of children in northern Yemen last year, and 43 children were killed. Third point, I argue that what's happening in war zones is the tip of the iceberg. And it's the tip of the iceberg in the sense that the rights of civilians to life could not be clearer on paper, but the abuse of those rights could not be clearer in reality. And that this abuse of the most fundamental rights in conflict zones is the international counterpart of what has been called democratic recession within countries. You'll know about the Larry Diamond argument about democratic recession, and I'm making the case that what's happening in war zones around the world is the international counterpart of that. Fourth, don't worry, there aren't 15 points, but fourth point on this. This is about power. The people who are committing these crimes are banking on the fact, with good reason at the moment, that they're not going to get caught and they're not going to be held accountable. And if there is a issue of the imbalance of power, the only fundamental corrective is to rebalance power, to change the calculus. And that's why I talk about in the Foreign Affairs piece, the need for countervailing power. This was the Galbraith phrase that he used in the 1950s about the American economy. And my argument is we've got to take that idea of countervailing power and build on it on the international scene. Otherwise, we're going to see further descent into lawlessness affecting more and more people. Fifth point, this is a job for government, for civil society, but for the private sector as well. Governments have to get their own house in order. They have to apply peer pressure. They have to have clubs that have rules. They have to have investigations of when things go wrong. Civil society has a role. The truth is, more has been found out about the abuse of rights in Syria by the Syrian Observatory on Human Rights or by Bellingcat than has been achieved by UN commissions of inquiry. And so civil society has a vital role in bearing witness. It's actually civil society that brought a suit in the German courts under universal jurisdiction against some Syrian generals, which the German government supported, and they were held accountable. But I think there's an important role for the private sector as well, because per the statistic you quoted, if you want to get anything done in the modern world, you do need government, you do need civil society, but private sector has a role too. And there's a moral argument, obviously, on private sector leaders, but I also want to make, and I think I make this point in the Davos speech that you've circulated, governments which neglect human rights end up neglecting property rights. And I think there's a self-interested argument as well as a moral argument, if you like, for those who are in the finance sector or those who are in the arms manufacturing sector or those who are in the tech sector. I think there's big responsibility there too. So at 30,000 feet, that's the argument.
So thank you, and that argument is very helpful. I have one final question, and then we'll open it up. In the Davos speech of last year that we have circulated internally in chat, you noted, it was striking to me, you noted how after the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Vladimir Putin and the Saudi prince were seen giving high fives at a G20 summit, which reminds me of even more recently after the government of Belarus forced the landing of a Ryanair jet to arrest a journalist. The very next week, you had the dictator of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, on the yacht of Vladimir Putin, hugging and smiling and whispering into each other's ear. The question here, David, is what does this reflect in the broader sense? What is it that is inspiring the confidence and brazenness of autocrats? And we in democracies, are we losing our self-confidence?
Definitely to that. I mean, let me try to answer that in two ways. First of all, part of the explanation of the shift in the balance of power, the shift in the calculus of the combatants in war, is that they've got protection. There's a protection racket. And the protection comes from the fact that for the first time in 100 years, in 2019, the combined GDP of the world's autocracies was greater than the combined GDP of the world's Western democracies. I mean, that's an obvious fact. It's not just about China, but China's a big part of the story. And we know that the founding tenet, not just of Chinese foreign policy, but of Russian foreign policy, you can go through the founding tenet of the foreign policy of autocrats everywhere is what goes on within your own country is only your own business. And universal rights is sort of nonsense on stilts, to quote Jeremy Bentham. And so there is there's undoubtedly protection, and you can see that in the UN Security Council, which denies commissions of inquiry into bombings of health centers in Syria. So that global geopolitical shift in power is playing out in the places where the International Rescue Committee works. But there's a second part of the story, and this is where the kind of dialogue that I think you, Jeff, and your organization are trying to foster is really important, to disentangle terms of left and right and liberal and conservative are used, and there's some important disentangling here. It's one reason I was quite keen. I'm a sort of centre-left person, I'm a social democrat. I wanted to come and have this conversation in part because we've got to disentangle what's going on here. You talked about self-confidence in the West, but I think it's deeper than that. Yes, there's been a loss of confidence. People look at Iraq, Afghanistan, they say, well, look, even if we want to do the right thing, we don't know how to do the right thing. So there's a loss of confidence from that. People say, well, we've got our own problems, so we haven't got the brain space or the bandwidth to tackle other people's problems. People say that as well. But there's a deeper argument going on, I think. It's an argument in the first place about sovereignty. And it's an unresolved argument in the Western world. For a European like me, I live and work in New York, but I'm British, obviously, and I'm still a European despite Brexit. For middle-sized European countries, it's very comfortable for us to say that, of course, the nation state is the building block of the international system, and of course, national sovereignty is very important. But it's conventional wisdom in some quarters, obviously very divisive. It's certainly not majority opinion, but it's conventional wisdom that sharing of sovereignty is meaningful and necessary in a hyper-connected world. Now, to state the obvious, America has always had a different view of its international entanglements. You as a country have always been very reticent about international treaties, international criminal court, etc. But there's no question in my mind that there is an intellectual question that the West is confronting about to what extent are universal rights our business. My argument is that the rights that civilians have in war have been written down and signed up to by 193 countries in the United Nations. So we've said it's our business. The rights of protesters on the streets of Moscow, the rights, etc., that's a fuzzier area for some people. But in this crystal clear area where the rights of individuals have been asserted, not to uphold them and not to be committed to uphold them is more than an issue of confidence. It's a matter of intellect. And then secondly, sorry for the long answer, but I think the question for the West is that it's disunited. And the argument that I make in the Foreign Affairs piece is that the quote unquote freedom agenda of George Bush, founded on democracy promotion, was too grandiloquent. But the atrocity prevention agenda that was pursued by President Obama was too technocratic. And my argument is that the place that Western countries and Western small L liberals should place themselves, those who are concerned about the survival of liberal society, we should place ourselves on the principle that power should never be exercised without accountability. Stanley Baldwin, conservative British Prime Minister in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, said that power without responsibility is the refuge of the harlot throughout the ages. And my argument is accountability promotion should be the foundation stone of our approach to international relations. And there are consequences for how we understand sovereignty and a whole range of other issues in that. So sorry for the long answer, but I think it's important.
Very important and enormously helpful. So we have a lot of material to work with now. We have a good solid 20 minutes for Q&A. You can raise your hand in chat. You can put your question in chat. You can wave your hands. If I miss you, Rochelle, help me. And if you would be succinct as courtesy to colleagues so we can get as many in as possible. And Fritz, do I see you somewhere there with a question?
Yes,
Yes, please.
I put it in chat there. And very simply, how prepared is the IRC for what is coming in Afghanistan? And can you, in fact, even provide any specifics at this point about IRC preparations?
Jeff, why don't you take 3 or 4 questions and it'll allow me to get through more. I promise you I'm not doing that in order to dodge the difficult ones.
No. Crystal clear and happy to do it that way. Mike Fox, you want to join in?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And thank you, David, for sharing your time. My question is, how do we make supporting refugees an attractive item to voters, or at least, let's say, a less demagoguable, which is definitely not a word, but I tried, issue. Thank you.
We get the point, Mike, and let's take at least one more this round. Joe, where do I see Joe?
Right here. Thank you so much.
I don't see you, but go ahead, please.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I was wondering, given your experience dealing with European politics, what is your thought on the Hungary problem when we have a member of our side of the fence that's backsliding so starkly on basic freedoms and principles? How we essentially set our own house in order, whether the opportunities and perils in that regard.
And David, thank you, David. Before you fire away, Mike Fox is a former Georgetown student of mine who is now co-chair of our Circle of Friends. He's just been accepted to the U.S. Foreign Service. And then Fritz Heinzen is a friend of ours, American Purpose out in Fairfax, Virginia. And Joe, would you say a word about who you are before David answers?
Yes, Center for Intelligence Research and Analysis. My specialty is Chinese information warfare, Chinese influence operation.
Thanks, Joe.
Great. All good questions. We have 1,196 staff in Afghanistan. 1,188 of them are Afghans at all levels. And I mean, how public or private is this? Are we going on? Is this going out publicly, or are we just amongst the group?
This is open and will be posted on YouTube.
Okay.
So otherwise, I mean, just to be clear, it's an open conversation.
So look, we're working in 9 provinces across the country and have seen extraordinary engagement by Afghan communities with the services that we provide and that our Afghan staff provide. We provide education to boys and girls in areas across the country, some of which are under government control and some of which are not under government control. We provide health services. We provide services for victims of sexual violence and gender-based violence. We provide economic livelihood support. And it's right to relay that there's a very high degree of concern about the future of the country, about the stability of the country. But there's also a very high level of commitment to the country from the people who are working for us, because they are proud Afghans. And I think that obviously people accept the decision that has been made. There's nothing they can do about that. But they are very concerned that the promises for humanitarian and development support are fulfilled. They know that 84% of the American aid has been military over the last 10 years, and the European figure is the inverse. And they really want that to continue, to go through government channels, but also non-government channels. But there are also very serious concerns about the security situation. And obviously in an open situation like that, I have to think, first of all, about the interests of our staff, whose confidence comes from the way in which the communities they serve value their services. And that's our best defense, because in all parts of the country, those who are in control are concerned about whether or not the populations under their control are satisfied or not. And so that's our best defense, because obviously we're not armed, we're a humanitarian organization. And so you asked for specifics. I can't go into security specifics, but I can say that we work across the country with those who are in control to deliver our services in a principled way, and we rely on the confidence of the communities we work with to protect us, really. In terms of Mike's question about how to make refugees attractive voters, I mean, I'm the son of refugees, as it happens, and my lesson of the last 7 years is that the best advocates for refugees are refugees themselves. The baker from Damascus who got bombed from his house and is now in Silver Spring, Maryland, talking about why he left and why he's now a patriotic and productive American. That's the way to show what a refugee is. The Afghan who was a translator and is now working in business in California, another one comes to mind. That's the way to make the case. And actually, there's a very interesting telling example from the Trump years. President Trump didn't just reduce the number of refugees allowed to come in. He also said that before any refugee was allowed into any resettlement opportunity, the state governor and the mayor of the city had to support their arrival. And 43 states, including Republican states and Democratic states, signed up for this with the city mayors before the executive order was found unconstitutional. And so there is support out there, but it comes from really knowing who these people are and then thinking, oh my God, it's a physical trainer, it's an accountant, it's a farmer, it's a housewife. It could be me. That's the humanity that I think is the way to win the political argument. One coda, which is very important. In my experience, going back to the 1990s in politics in Britain, when issues of immigration and issues of refugees are confused, it's bad for immigrants and bad for refugees. And the fact that there hasn't been an immigration act since 1986 is a problem, not just for those who are concerned about immigration. It's the refugee issue gets piled into that. Very briefly on Hungary, look, clubs have got to stick by the rules. And to the extent that the ruling bodies of clubs don't uphold their rules without fear or favor, and those clubs can be the European Union as a whole, it could be the European People's Party, it can be a whole range of intermediate institutions. Hungary is an enormous beneficiary of being a member of the European Union, and with benefits come responsibilities. And I'm afraid there's been inconstancy in the way that the European Union has defended its own rules, and that will only encourage the testing of the boundaries. And it's a very serious situation, constitutionally, politically, but also in sheer political terms in Hungary. And my reading is that the clubs have got to show their strength.
So, David, thank you. Before we go to the next round, since you alluded to it, may I ask you to provide a personal detail? How and when and under what circumstances did your mother arrive in Great Britain?
My mother came as a 12-year-old girl in 1946. Her father was killed in a concentration camp, and her mother, for reasons not completely clear, put her on a boat that was run by a man called Rabbi Schoenfeld, and he brought a boatload of children to the UK, and she was admitted, and that's how she ended up being a student at the London School of Economics, where she met my father, who was also a refugee from Belgium. He'd come in 1940 and became a student of Harold Lasky's, actually, at the LSE in the 1940s, after he'd been in the Navy for 3 years.
Thank you. It's an amazing story and inspiring, and underscores why what you're doing today is labor of love and of real responsibility. David, thank you. I'm going to turn to Michael Allen, National Endowment for Democracy. Okay. And is there anybody else right now?
Get away from the police. That's your voice.
You cut out. Can you say that again, please? I may be having a tech problem on my end, but in any case, we'll get as many in as we can. And Michael, let's just go to you with about 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I should start by saying, David, I was a student of your father's at Leeds University in in the mid-70s. And although, like you, as a Labour Party Social Democrat, I didn't agree with all of his ideological commitments, shall we say, he was an inspirational speaker and a man of great intellectual integrity, and I'm afraid of a nature of which is increasingly rare, I think particularly amongst the Marxist left in academia. But leaving that aside, my question is really about, I guess, two questions. One is, oh, by the way, thank you for mentioning Bellingcat, which is a grantee of the NED, and does amazing work. But my questions are, how does one go about forming such a coalition, the Countervailing Power Coalition that you referred to, at a time when international institutions and international norms are under such attack, or to a degree being discredited? One thinks of the UN Human Rights Council, for example. How does one institutionalize and make sustainable such a coalition? And secondly, we're referring here to states, and as I recall from reading your article a few days ago, most of the references are to state actors. But as we know, many regimes, particularly authoritarian regimes, are outsourcing military activities. One thinks of the Wagner Group, Russia using the Wagner Group in places like Libya, Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, I guess the model for this has been Iran with Hezbollah and other actors in Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. So how do state or international, multilateral state-based institutions address the problem of non-state actors engaging in the violations you're keen to address?
Michael, thank you. And David, if I may I squeeze one more in this round? Is that okay?
Of course.
So Richard Aldous of Bard College, and who is our colleague at American Purpose and hosts a wonderful weekly podcast, Books and Authors, called Bookstack. Richard, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank you, David. I heard Tony Blair the other day talking about the frustrations of influencing change, bringing about change from outside Parliament, outside government. You've done both as Foreign Secretary and now as President of the International Rescue Committee. I just wonder if you could talk about the differences, the frustrations, the challenges of doing things from inside government and doing them from outside government.
Thanks. Do you want me to answer those, or do you want to do more, Jeff?
Let's take those two and see where we are.
First of all, to Michael, thank you so much for saying such nice things about my dad. That really means a lot to me. Obviously, he was my dad more than it wasn't a professor in my life. He was a dad. But the fact that he had such an influence on you, I think, or it made such an impression, is really nice. And one thing just I think is important for this audience. I always remember my dad said to me that he was a Marxist, but he taught Burke with as much passion as he taught Marx, and that it was his job to be as persuasive in explaining the points of view of writers on the right as writers on the left. And it really troubles me. I'm obviously not in a university at the moment, but it troubles me when I hear that that's an unusual point of view. I mean, the essence of a liberal society is diversity of viewpoint. And my dad's inaugural lecture was called "Teaching Politics in a Time of Crisis" in 1973, and I didn't read it as an 8-year-old. Obviously, it wasn't required reading around the breakfast table. But when I went back to look at it, it had some echoes for me, and it was I'll never forget the. Sorry for this diversion, but I think it's kind of interesting. The Vice Chancellor of Leeds University at the time when you were there, Michael, was a man called Edward Boyle, who had been the Conservative Education Secretary in the, I think, Heath government from 1970 to 74, or possibly even in the Macmillan government before then. And my dad always said that he'd learned from Edward Boyle, who made a point as a former conservative minister, of turning up at these lectures by a Marxist and saying how important it was that students and faculty were exposed to these Marxist arguments, which I thought was really important. Look, building a coalition, you start small, not big, and you start with those who agree with you, and you build it out from there. And that's how you show power. That's how you build power. You don't start at the UN Human Rights Council. You start in the political West. But I think the thing about an accountability promotion campaign is that it doesn't get you into regime change questions. It gets you into accountability questions at the international level. Now, obviously, democratic societies are the ultimate version of an accountable system. But I think there's a way of threading this needle that is important. And it's very striking to me that in the discussion of democratic recession, Larry Diamond and others say it's not just democratic societies that are becoming illiberal, illiberal societies are becoming less liberal. And that's why I think this accountability, and the Achilles heel of the autocracies, obviously, you think of Russia and China, is that they have no succession plan. And that I think is, that accountability question is important there. Your point about non-state actors not just being international terrorist groups, but sponsored mercenaries and others. I mean, I won't go into it, but Central African Republic, of all places, has got a very extensive sponsored security apparatus. I think that there's a real responsibility to recognize that the tentacles of the nation state stretch to non-state actors, and so does responsibility. I've got a figure in my head that the Uppsala conflict database says at the moment that they have a special category of internationalized intrastate conflicts. And not only is the category of internationalized intrastate conflicts growing fast, but the internationalization of intrastate conflict has gone up fivefold in the last 15 years. And in the same way that I'm afraid American responsibility applies when it's part of the Saudi-led coalition, so does Russian responsibility when it's got its own groups that are operating anywhere, or Iranian or others. And one of the, you mentioned, Jeff, or someone said in passing, getting your own house in order. Getting your own house in order means military to military contacts for the coalitions you're in. And I tried to bring that point out because I think it's important. Richard, I could spend about 5 hours on your question, I'm afraid, but you're lucky for you, we're in the last 5 minutes. Look, without wishing to be glib, it's simple. In government, you have much more power to do things, but the obstacles to getting anything done are bigger. In an NGO, you have much less power to do anything, but the obstacles to getting anything done are smaller. That's the trade-off. And in a way, it's two ends of the telescope. There's no greater privilege than to represent your country. So I'm not sort of sackcloth and ashes about this. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But equally, I'm someone who thinks you've always got to think about what you're going to do next, not what you did last. And I think that that's the way I understand the situation I and others are in at the moment. And I know Tony is monumentally frustrated, of course, by mistakes that are made by his successors. But we all are. But that's life, and one has to try and make a difference where one can.
So thank you all, and David, thank you very much. We're wrapping up now. I'm heartened to hear you mention more than once today Larry Diamond. He's a member of our editorial board. Michelle, in January, I think the 22nd of January, Larry wrote a piece for Us, American Purpose, on how we pursue accountability here in this country to make democracy healthy, whole, and vibrant. If you can fish that out and post it, that would be great. David, I have one last short question for you, and then I'm going to give you the final word as the guest of honor. The question, I'm quite confident you've never heard it before. And here goes. You're committed to the International Rescue Committee, and you are truly a man of service. That's how we understand you and your career and the work you do and have done. Is there any circumstance where, out of obligation and responsibility, you would return to Great Britain to politics?
Look, I'm always answer that in the same way, which is not a very heroic answer and not a very satisfying answer, which is that I don't know what I'm going to do next. I'm very focused on what I'm doing at the moment. I wish people sometimes, some of the younger members of staff come and talk to me about their careers, and I say, I'm not sure you should be talking to me because I'm not a very good example of career planning. But I feel very, very lucky to be leading the International Rescue Committee at this time. I feel, we've grown our impact, we've grown our influence, we've grown our ability to shape lives and shape thinking. But obviously, I hope I've got more in me, and I don't know what I'm going to do next. And I feel very proud to be British. I'm very concerned about where Britain is heading. And we've got some very big questions to address. So I honestly don't know. Of course, politics changes. I mean, it's one of the things that you struggle with in your writings and in your work, that the political process has changed a lot in the last 20 years. And the fusion of politics and celebrity is something that I wasn't brought up with in the same way. And some of the golden rules of politics about consistency, about nuance, about judgment, about the linearity of politics, that they've been very systematically broken, and there'd have to be a lot of relearning, I think, before I thought I could make a difference there. But sorry to be the opposite of definitive. Sorry to be unclear. But I always say that I'm going to try and devote my professional life to where I can make the biggest difference according to my values and expertise, consistent with my responsibilities to my family. So that's the best answer I can give, I'm afraid, Jeff. It's an honest one.
Well, it's a fine and splendid answer, David. David, you've been with people who are close to us, as you see on screen, is diverse in age, gender, intellectual, and other ways. And if you had any final thought for us and our group, our community, about what you're doing or about how we can be helpful, you'd have that final word right now.
Thanks very much. Well, I hope some of you will get a chance to, or all of you will visit the IRC website, rescue.org, and learn about what we're doing. And if there are ways of taking our argument about the age of impunity to new corners, someone put in the chat and I've just clicked on it. Michael's got a piece about accountability that I'm going to read. That would be great, because obviously I can reserve a small part of my brain for thought leadership issues, but I'm trying to be a engaged CEO with my own teams. And so I'm relying on you to do some heavy thinking about how to develop the idea of an accountability promotion campaign, how to make it better, how to give it substance. And if you can do so in a way that tries to address both the issues of principle around accountability as opposed to democracy, but also get into these questions about how does the center right and the center left understand the implications of hyper interdependence, the hyper connected world. How should we understand questions of sovereignty in the modern world? How should we understand questions of shared sovereignty? I think that's really important on the center left and on the center right, because just to say we should all be damned as quote unquote globalists doesn't do the trick. And I think there's really an important need in this hyper-connected world to figure out how we conserve the global commons as a liberal pluralist place, not an authoritarian and autocratic place.
So with that, to all of you, thank you for valuable time, a fabulous discussion. David Miliband, we're grateful.
Thank you very much.
Beautifully done. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.